Okay, so this is the second, as I mentioned, in the church. This is the second of a two-part series. So we'll start by doing a little bit of a reminder of where we got to last week, and that'll be good for people that had missed that session last week. So we set out just to kind of map the terrain, as it were, and see how many Gospels are there and what shape are they, what kind of documents are they, and so on. With the idea that we need to get a sense of what the total set of gospel documents from the early church looked like. We know there are 4 in the New Testament, but in fact we discovered there were more like 30 gospels that have survived, either in whole or just as a fragment. So 26 got excluded and 4 of them got included. So the first thing we noted was that in the 2nd and 3rd century, the early Christians loved reading Gospels. They loved to read stories about Jesus, the adventures of the disciples, which are what are called the Acts genre. So there's not only the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, there's the Acts of Peter, and there's the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and the Acts of Thomas, and so on. These were like ripping yarns in 2nd century Roman Empire stuff, okay? And Gospels were a bit like that as well. The Gospel genre is something like the Viva genre, that a famous character from the Roman Empire would have a story told about him, but it wasn't our sense of a biography. They were more interested in character than in history. So they chose events and moments which demonstrated the character of their hero. And in particular for Romans, the thing that really determined your character was how well you died. How did you act under pressure? That's significant because a big chunk of the Gospels is actually the arrest and trial and execution of Jesus, because for a Roman audience, that's where you got to see the steel of the character, to see what he was like as a person. So we found there were multiple examples of books about Jesus. The 4 that are in the New Testament are called narrative Gospels because they basically tell a story. Even John's Gospel tells a story, although John is almost breaking down under the weight of all the speeches. In John, Jesus gives long speeches about himself, and there's not a lot of action. It's a lot of monologues by Jesus. Interestingly, the Gospel of John didn't make it into the New Testament until about 800, because people said, it's so different from the others. And it sounds so much like a Gnostic gospel that in some parts of the church it didn't get universal acceptance for several hundred years. So it was a controversial gospel. So whereas Matthew, Mark and Luke seem to have got in by around about 200 or so, John was on the list, but some parts went, oh no, that's too weird. We're not using that one. But eventually John kind of won its supporters. We don't have a complete copy of any of the Gospels before the first half of the 3rd century. I think it's P45, that particular papyrus codex has all 4 Gospels plus the book of Acts. And that's the earliest complete set of the Gospels where we get all the Gospel kind of thing. From the 2nd century, well, from the 1st century, nothing. Not surprising. I mean, things are very just being pieced together in the 1st century. Some of these books wouldn't have been written even by the end of the 1st century. When we get into the 2nd century, we have 2 tiny little fragments from John's Gospel, but we also have fragments from the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas, which didn't make it into the final New Testament, although they were in some of the early versions of the Bible. Fortunately, what we do have is other writers in the 2nd century, like Irenaeus, who was in southern France, in Lyon, and various others, Justin Martyr and so on. They quote from the Gospels. So that's not quite the same as knowing what the whole book looked like, but we have extensive quotation. So we know that a version of Matthew was in circulation, a version of Luke was in circulation, at least by about 150. But that doesn't mean that it was quite exactly the same. We can't prove it was our version of Luke till we get to the first half of the 3rd century. So that's what we kind of covered last week, which is how the books or how this kind of literature emerged and what ancient copies we have of the Gospels. And we finished up by looking at, we also notice one last point there. We noticed when we did some samples from all these different Gospels that each document tends to have its own voice, its own distinctive way of talking about Jesus. Matthew, for instance, makes Jesus sound very Jewish. Luke makes him sound very Roman, and so on, because they're writing for a particular audience. Okay, so we finished up with this photograph of the beginning of the Gospel of Mark from the oldest Bible that exists, which is Codex Sinaiticus, in other words, the book from Mount Sinai. Codex Sinaiticus. It's from the library at the monastery, at St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai in the Egyptian desert, in the wilderness of Sinai. And it's as I mentioned last week, this is the only book from the Roman Empire which has survived intact. Okay, so it's the oldest and only book from the sort of early Byzantine time of Constantine that has survived through. And it's a Bible. It's a beautifully produced Bible. It is a codex, it's a book, but when they moved from scrolls to codices, what they did was they chopped the scroll, which was, say, 20 metres long, they chopped it into slices that had 3 or 4 columns. Now, that's why a really serious book today, like a medical reference book or encyclopedia or a handbook of veterinary science, will have columns. A dictionary is in columns because it's a proper book. It has serious content. And so when they started to print books after the Gutenberg press invention, a printed book had to look like a real book. Not one of these newfangled printed things. It had to look like a real book. Well, the irony was the real book had to look like a scroll. And you can't read a scroll from the left-hand top edge all the way across to the end of the line and then come back to the left-hand edge of the page, okay? You're going to divide it into widths, columns about the width of a man's thigh, because that was your portable writing desk. And you roll the scroll from both ends, and as you went through, you wound up the left-hand side and you loosened the right-hand side, and so you always had 2 or 3 columns visible. So when they started making books, the codex, they made them. They just did the same thing. They ruled it up into columns with a little sharp marker. They just do an edge, so the scribe knew that's how far he could write. Now this scribe is he's got a very even hand. Okay, well-trained scribe. Whereas some of the other comments that have been written later, corrections, are not as neat. Little scribbled notes on the side. And that, as I was saying, this survives today because today, if it's a serious reference book, it'll be in columns, typically 2 or 3 columns of fairly small print. Okay, but we just know when we see a book printed like that, we sort of sit up and we pay attention because it's a serious book. No one ever told us that, but we just know it's a dictionary, it's a reference book, it's an encyclopedia, it'll be in columns. If it's the kind of book we want you to read and relax, it's not going to hurt you, then we put the lines all the way across the page. You can just relax about this one, and we know that's a novel. Okay? So if you get a Bible which is printed in columns, the printer is saying this is a study book. And often it'll have study Bible on the cover. And if you have a Bible that's for people that are not as comfortable with the Bible, it'll be printed from left to right. It's easy to read. It doesn't have such a heavy, formal feel to it. This is all because of the history as the technology changed from scrolls to codex to printed books. So that's just bringing it up a bit larger for us so we can see it. But as we mentioned last week, there are no gaps between the words. and there's no punctuation, and it's all in capitals.
What language would that
That's
be?
Greek,
Oh, Greek.
and it's the first page, first couple of columns of Mark. At the top it says Kata Markon, which is according to Mark, so the Gospel according to Mark. And you notice it's already been broken up into sections for reading in church. Somebody's already got to it, and someone's already decided this is the bit we read this Sunday, this is the bit we read the next bit, and so on. So although there are no gaps between the words, no punctuation, no capital G for God, no capital H for him, that's just an English convention from around the time of Shakespeare. Okay? This is all written in caps, and it's what they call uncial script, which is a bit of an exaggeration. Uncial means inch high, in other words, big letters. This is not the fine print. Okay, the fine print are called minuscule, and that's in upper and lower case. But these are official, very important documents, and you notice they look a bit like an inscription carved on a block of stone, because that's the other thing they're trying to touch for people subconsciously. This looks like an inscription put up by the emperor, because it's the Bible, so you've got to take it seriously. That's what was going on. Okay. So now we're going to change focus, and we're going to look not so much as where did the Gospels come from, but how do we get Matthew, Mark, and Luke? What's going on? And I said last week, if these three men had been boys at Grafton High School when Alan was teaching, they'd have been shunted off to the headmaster for cheating. Okay, because their essays have too much of common material. Okay, right down to, well, I can't say punctuation, but right down to the syntax, the grammar, the way that a phrase is shaped. And even if Jesus stops in mid-sentence, it says even that level of detail is copied from one gospel to the other. Okay, so these are not independent text, as it were. So a lot of information, you're not going to have to remember all this. I just want you to get a feel for what's going on. So the first thing is that Matthew, Mark and Luke, and leaving John aside, Matthew, Mark and Luke basically have the same story. And it goes like this. Jesus starts in Galilee. He does stuff for a bit. It causes a bit of a stir. He goes down to Jerusalem. He gets into trouble. The Romans kill him, but that's not the end of the story because of Easter Day. That's basically the story. Now, John has a very different story. Jesus is going to Jerusalem all the time. He doesn't start in the Galilee and make one trip to Jerusalem. He's constantly going to Jerusalem. Okay? And he's ministering in the south as well as ministering in the north. So John has a different... And he talks about himself all the time, whereas in Matthew, Mark and Luke, he talks about God's kingdom. He doesn't talk about himself. So John has a distinct voice for Jesus. And things like the Jesus going into the temple and chasing out the money changers and so on, Matthew, Mark and Luke will have that down here in the last days of Jesus. Okay? But for John, that story is back in chapter 2, right at the very start of his gospel. Okay, so it's not that every time Jesus went to Jerusalem he trashed the place. Okay, but John has chosen to put that story first, early in the story, that episode early in the story, because it's symbolic of what the ministry of Jesus is going to do to the Jewish religion. Whereas Matthew, Mark and Luke have left it in what is probably its historical point. See what's going on there? So because you can actually put Matthew, Mark and Luke side by side, and with one major exception here, Matthew, Mark and Luke basically have the same content. Interestingly, Mark has nothing equivalent to the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, Mark doesn't really do the teaching of Jesus. Mark focuses on what Jesus was doing rather than what Jesus was saying. So because Matthew, Mark and Luke can be looked at side by side, we have a label for, they're called synoptic gospels because you can look at them together. And synoptic means, sun is the Greek word for together, and optic, eyes, So synoptic means you can put these side by side and look at them together. As soon as you try to do that with John, the fourth column is all over, it's a mess. Okay? Now I've actually got here a synopsis of the four Gospels. When I was a student, these were the tools we used. These days it's all on computer. But these actually give you the Gospel side by side. You can see there, this is a chunk out of John. I just happened to open it at random. Matthew, Mark and Luke have empty columns because there's nothing in Matthew, Mark and Luke that correlates with this passage from John. Whereas if you go further back, whatever this is Jesus healing the woman with a hemorrhage. So we find it in Matthew, Mark and Luke, and there's an empty column down here for John because that story doesn't appear in John. Sorry? No, it's one of my books. I have way too many books, but you're welcome to be sort of playing.
No, I think
You're welcome to pass it around.
I was just wondering, because
Yeah.
I remember
So that-
those to the church.
Yeah. So the point is that when we look at this, these three are telling basically the same story. John has the same character, the same cast in the same location, but a different story. Okay. Length is, just see very quickly, Matthew has 1,068 verses. Luke has 1,098 verses. Mark has 661 verses. In other words, even though verses can be shorter or longer, this is telling us that Mark is short, Matthew and Luke are longer and are roughly the same size. Why is that? Because scrolls came in standard lengths. Mark is using, in our language, a 48-page exercise book, and Matthew and Luke are using a 96-page exercise book. And they're going to fill it up. Because with a scroll, you can't just add another paragraph. Okay, you're going to use the whole scroll. So Mark is a standard length for a short scroll, and Matthew and Luke are standard lengths for a longer scroll. It wasn't coincidence that they're roughly the same length. 117 scenes, 95 scenes, 120 scenes. Okay, we get it. They're more or less, Matthew and Luke are very, very similar. 225 sayings attributed to Jesus in Matthew, 80 in Mark, and 182 in Luke. Okay? So length tells us, so Mark is an abbreviated, a shorter treatment. When we look at what's in Matthew, Mark and Luke together, we get this material, which we call the triple tradition. But we can also look at what's only in Matthew and Mark, or what's only in Mark and Luke, or what's only in Matthew and Luke. And this becomes the interesting bit, because this is stuff which is not in Mark, but it is in Matthew and Luke. So where did it come from? Okay? For that matter, where did Mark's stuff come from? But you know, we'll see how this fits in a minute. We look at what gets left out. Okay. Luke, interestingly, leaves out quite a bit of stuff that's in Matthew and Mark. For instance, Mark and Matthew have two stories of the feeding miracle. Matthew says one of those is enough, thank you. Okay, so he chops out multiple scenes out of Matthew and Mark. Luke just skips over that because he's got other stuff he wants. Remember, he's only got this much space on the scroll. He wants to put extra stuff in, so he's going to have to take some stuff out. And if there's duplication in Mark, Luke's going to go, don't need the second version of that, thank you very much.
But the writers of the Gospels would say that they actually commissioned to do that work?
Good question. We have no idea. There's no evidence as to why they did this. Luke gives us, we saw at the end of last week, that John talks about there being lots of books, and if all the books were written about Jesus that could be written, it would fill the world. But that doesn't tell us why they were doing it. And Luke tells us at the beginning of his gospel, he writes to a person called Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus. Now, that tends to suggest that Theophilus is a Roman official, and that Luke was writing in some way for this Roman official who's become a Christian, because he said, I want you to have accurate information about what you have been taught. Okay? But Theophilus is also a word that means lover of God. So it's a bit like the old Frank and Ernest radio show. Was it actually two men called Frank and Ernest, or is it a joke about, one guy is always Frank and one guy is always so earnest? Okay, so is Theophilus a Frank and Ernest thing, or is Theophilus? And Theophilus was a person's name. I mean, there were people called Theophilus.
Still are.
Well, and in the Greek community, of course, there still are. Yes, exactly. I mean, not so much in British society, but in Greek society, you still get Theophilus. Okay, yeah. So we don't know whether he's really writing it for this individual or whether it's, dear earnest lover of God, I'm writing this so that you will understand the truth of the matters about which you have been instructed. Okay, Theophilus could be the guy who paid for the bill. Okay, because it would cost about a year's pay to write one of these books. Very expensive. So in our terms, to rank a copy of the gospel, to write the gospel, would cost $60,000 or $75,000. Okay, and that's why, think about it, most local Christian churches could not afford a copy of the gospels, especially 4 gospels. Okay, because it was very expensive. And to have scribes with the training to write this out, and not just to create it, but even just to sort of copy it, is a highly skilled and very expensive process. You try writing out a hymn by hand and see how many mistakes you make before you get to the end of the hymn. You see it on PowerPoint slides all the time. Okay? Oops, wrong words get picked up. So Luke leaves out a lot of stuff. Matthew doesn't leave out as much, but even Mark has a whole lot of stuff which is just not found in his gospel. Surprise, his gospel is shorter because it's going to have less stuff in it. Matthew has some unique material, about 35 scenes, 38 sayings, which are only found in Matthew. They don't occur in Mark, they don't occur in Luke. Some of them occur in the Gospel of Thomas, but in terms of the New Testament Gospels, they're unique to Matthew. Luke, on the other hand, has 48 scenes that are only found in Luke and 39 sayings that are only found in Luke. Poor old Mark. He has 10 scenes that are not copied by Matthew and Luke, and he has one saying that isn't copied by Matthew and Luke.
He's an important source, isn't he?
He's clearly a source, and we'll think about later, why did they even bother putting Mark in? Because effectively, everything in Mark is in either Matthew or Luke, with a couple of exceptions. Okay. So I just finished this last column. When you look at what's only found in Matthew and Luke, but it is found in both of them, so it's not unique to Matthew, not unique to Luke, it's found in both Matthew and Luke, we find about 218 verses, 5 episodes or scenes, Jesus healing or casting out a demon or whatever, and 77 sayings of Jesus, which are shared by Matthew and Luke and are not found in Mark. Okay? And when we turn this around across the other way, I think it is this one. No, it's the other way. Go back to the previous one. It's those 77 things which are not found in Mark. That's the same 77 sayings. So this stuff which is in both Matthew and Luke, and is not found in Mark, is believed by most scholars to be a lost collection of Jesus' teachings. And it has the code name in biblical scholarship of Q, which is not a British spy master, okay? But it's from the German word Quelle, meaning source. Because a lot of biblical scholarship in the 19th century was being done in Germany, and they kind of set the agenda for some of this. So we'll come back to that. So what we look at the patterns of agreement and disagreement between them. We compare pairs of gospel, Matthew and Mark as a set, and Mark and Luke as a set, have twice as much agreement as pairs than the 3 gospels have. So Mark is sort of the common element in this kind of analysis, of course. Similarly, Matthew and Luke only agree with each other in the order of the content when they're copying from Mark. Well, when the material is the same as Mark. When they're doing their own stuff and not using marker material, they disagree. They put it all over the place in different spots in the Bible, in the Gospel. Okay? So that suggests that Mark is kind of the critical element in all this. And similarly, if we keep going on, Matthew and Luke, in each of their Gospels, have double the amount of material that's in Mark's, the same order as Mark, as they agree with each other. So where they agree, they tend to agree with Mark. When they're not following Mark, Matthew and Luke tend to be diverging. The same thing being said here. They also have a number of 75, 77, whatever, sayings that are not found in Mark. They have them, but they use them in different places in the Gospels. Okay? Again, suggesting that Mark is kind of has this pivotal role. And just, I think it's getting towards the end of the data. When we look at the style of the writing, Mark is the most, it's interesting, we often use Mark when teaching New Testament Greek because it's easy Greek. It's also really bad Greek, but it's easy for students to learn. Okay? It's not very flash, it's not very sophisticated. It's the least polished, and it's like spoken Greek rather than literary Greek. Matthew tends to tidy up Mark's grammar and make nicer transitions from one scene to the next, whereas Mark tends to say euthus, and euthus is the Greek word for immediately. And immediately he did this, and immediately he did that, and Matthew has, and after leaving the synagogue he went to the house. He just kind of puts a nice little transition in there. Luke writes the best Greek in anywhere in the New Testament, even better than Paul. Okay? Mind you, even Luke's Greek is not flash. He's not a 5th century Athenian writing proper Greek. It's still average Greek, but Luke has the best Greek of any of the New Testament authors. So he's a somewhat more literate Hellenistic person than the Matthew and Luke characters. When they're reporting the same passage that we also find in Mark, Luke's wording is always closer to Mark's version than to Matthew's version.
Just on the words, if I may, did Jesus speak in Aramaic or something like that, not Greek?
Correct. Jesus almost certainly didn't speak his message in Greek.
So when we have his sayings,
they've already changed to another language.
Version,
They've already moved on. They've moved on in the memory of the early church.
yes.
People have said this is good stuff,
Yes.
and they've kept repeating it,
Yes,
but they've
quite
repeated
right.
it in their own language now,
Yeah.
which is Greek. So it's gone from Aramaic or possibly Hebrew. Most people would say Aramaic, and it's now jumped across to Koine Greek. And Koine Greek is a little bit like Pidgin English. Not quite as extreme as Pidgin English to English, but Koine Greek is ordinary Greek, common Greek. It's the Greek used by the sailors and the merchants around the Mediterranean world. And that's what the New Testament is written in. Okay?
Interesting, isn't it, that transition?
Yeah. Because the early Christians were into sharing the message. They weren't into being all arty. Okay? As we said last week, they dumped the scroll. Scroll was too expensive. There's this new cheap thing called a codex. And it's really handy. If you're travelling, you can stick it in your, well, you don't have pockets, but you can shove it down your toga or whatever and take it with you. Scrolls, you've got to kind of put them under your arm and walk onto the boat, okay? So early Christians, they jumped into Greek, they jumped into the codex. Okay, so, and they wrote letters. I mean, 2/3 of the New Testament are letters. Letters of Paul, letters of Peter, letters of John, letters of James, and so on. Not necessarily really by those people, but the point is, you know, apart from the 4 Gospels, you've got something like 19 letters and 1 book of Acts and 1 Apocalypse.
It's important that he write in Greek.
Yes, and even Paul is writing in Greek. This is next week's topic, but you know, Paul describes himself as having come from what we would say is southern Turkey, from Tarshish. So he's from the Jewish diaspora, And he grew up in an observant Jewish family. He knows Hebrew, possibly knows Aramaic, less likely that he'd know Aramaic, but he's been taught synagogue Hebrew, but because he's fluent in Greek.
Yeah.
Greek is in effect his first
That's all
language.
preaching he did. Yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah. Whereas Jesus might have known a few words of Greek because Greek had been around for several centuries already.
Mm.
And even words like synagogue, it's a Greek word. Okay, it's the same soon, together, and goge means to gather or to lead. Synagogue is where you gather people together. Sanhedrin, it's a Greek word. Okay, the boule, the council, it's a Greek word, and so on. So even in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, the most anti-Greek faction in the Jewish leadership, they still use Greek words. They write them in Aramaic letters, but they write Greek words in Aramaic letters.
Thanks.
Okay, so Greek it's like English today in a sense, or like Chinese might be in 100 years. All right, aren't you glad you're alive now? Okay, so Luke and the point being made here is that Luke and Matthew hardly ever agree with each other except when they're exactly copying Mark, and that Luke's transitions, and we'll see this in an example in a moment, tend to be a little bit more sophisticated than what we find either in Mark and, of course, never the same as what we find in Matthew. Okay.
So does that mean that Mark's Gospel was written first? Or?
Almost certainly. Go to the head of the class. Yes, you can wipe the blackboard off at the end because you're the prize student. That's exactly what it means, yes, that with all that stuff going on, you tend to go, So it's not actually Matthew, Mark, Luke, it's actually Mark, Matthew, Luke, if you're thinking about it chronologically. But remember, the books in the Bible are not arranged by the date of publication. They're partly grouped by category, Gospels, Acts, Paul, other letters, Apocalypse, okay? But then within those sets, they're arranged by length. Okay, so Romans comes first because it's the longest of Paul's letters, not because it's the first of his letters. Same as the Quran. The surah in the Quran are organised by length, not by the date when the prophet heard them or whatever. But that's not quite what's happening in the Gospel because you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Matthew, Luke, and John are more or less the same length. They're all using the 96-page exercise book or whatever number it was. Matthew is presumably first because it's the most Jewish, so it's closest to the Old Testament. Okay? And also, amongst other things, Matthew is the only gospel that uses the word church. So that bumps it up a bit as well. But it's probably because it's so Jewish that it's a nice segue from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Now, I'm sorry for that. I couldn't make this any bigger without no longer fitting on the page. This is the story we know as the rich young ruler. Okay, we all know the story. A rich young man who's a powerful man from the ruling class comes up to Jesus and says, "What do I have to do to be saved? Good teacher, what do I have to do to be saved?" And Jesus said, why are you calling me good? Like, what's going on? You know what you've got to do. Keep the commandments. Now let's move on. Okay? And the guy said, "Well, I did all that since I was a kid." And Jesus looks at him and says, "Well, what you need to do is give it all away and come and follow me." And he goes away sad because he was rich. And then the next story is Jesus says, "Gee, it's hard to be saved when you're rich. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." And those two stories always circulate together, which is interesting. You don't find them separately. Now the trouble is, in Luke, he's a ruler. Okay? In Matthew, he's a young man. And in all three Gospels, he's rich. And that has turned into the rich young ruler, because that's what we were told in Sunday school. They took the young bit from Matthew, the ruler bit from Luke, and the rich bit from the basic story in Mark, and we get Jesus and the rich young ruler. Okay, that's a Sunday school mash. That's not what's in the Bible. Matthew, he's a rich young man. In Mark, he's a rich man. And in Luke, he's a rich ruler, but not young. Okay? So they're just little nuances on the story. Okay. The other nuances include things like in Mark, if Jesus was setting out on a journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments," and starts quoting the 10 Commandments. Matthew goes, "Oh, ouch, we can't have Jesus saying that. Now, why are you calling me good? Only God is good. Like, I'm not God. Why are you calling me good?" Matthew goes, "Sorry, Mark, we can't have that." So Matthew changes it just slightly. So it reads, "Then someone came up to him." He's not starting out on a journey. "Someone came up to him and said, 'Teacher,'" not good teacher, "'Teacher, what good deed must I do?'" Just change a couple of words here and there in sequence. "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" Not why do you call me good. Why do you ask me about what is good? The only one who is good, there is only one who is good. If you wish to enter life, keep the commandments. Very Jewish answer. Paul, of course, would disagree and give Matthew a fail for his understanding of salvation, because it's not by keeping the commandments, it's having faith in Jesus. So you can see Matthew is representing a more conservative Jewish kind of voice here. And then he goes on to quote all this. Whereas in Mark, he says, "Well, I've done all that ever since my youth," implying he's no longer a young man. And in Luke, slightly different, "A certain ruler asked him." Okay. "Good teacher," Mark's language, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." So Luke doesn't have Matthew's sensitivity to calling Jesus good, which we saw, but also Luke has turned the guy into a ruler, and the word he's used in Greek is despotes, from which we get the word despot. Okay, so he's a member of the ruling class.
Is there any general theory about the intended audience or recipients of these, which might account for those two?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So, as I was kind of hinting, Mark has the basic story, and it's a bit rough around the edges.
Yes.
Matthew is writing clearly for a more Jewish audience.
Yes, right.
And so Jesus gives a Jewish answer. Luke is writing for an audience of wealthy and powerful Roman citizens.
That's very helpful.
So the character becomes one of them. Okay, and Luke is the gospel, has lots of parables about wealth and has wealthy people paying Jesus bills, because whereas in other parts of the Gospels, God loves poor people, in Luke, God really loves rich people.
Very helpful, isn't it?
So you can see he's kind of, we'd say, spinning it these days. He's spinning the message just a little bit for his audience, for relevance. And then you start to hear a kind of like a fingerprint. You get a sort of a voice print, and you can hear a passage. You go, "Gee, that sounds like Matthew." Like, "Woe to you hypocrites, blind guides, Pharisees, scum of the earth." That's Matthew. Okay, Luke leaves all that stuff out. It's not very becoming to have Jesus talking like that. Okay, so not only are they somehow or other working together, it appears that Mark is the critical common ground, but Matthew and Luke share some other material, but Luke never seems to have seen a copy of Matthew, because he never agrees with Matthew against Mark. He always agrees with Mark against Matthew. So it sounds like he's not, whether he's seen it or not, he's not particularly interested in Matthew. So now we'll try and draw some conclusions. Matthew and Luke each have a literary relationship with Mark, and Mark therefore comes first. It's a more primitive gospel. It doesn't have a nice birth story at the beginning. It doesn't even have a proper Easter story at the end. It's a funny kind of text. All four of them, including John, are basically story gospels rather than collections of sayings. Matthew chooses to finish the story at Easter, and with the final goodbye at the end of chapter 28. I'm with go into all the world, make disciples, baptizing them. Interestingly, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's high Trinitarian language for Jesus to be using in April of the year 30. Okay, probably being voiced a little bit there. So Matthew ends with basically the risen Jesus appearing to his disciples, setting them out to all the nations. Don't just go to the Jewish people. Go out to all the nations. Make disciples of all nations, which for a Jewish gospel is quite remarkable. Go back to the start of Matthew's gospel. Who are the heroes at the beginning of his gospel? The three wise men. Well, the wise men. There's not three of them, but they gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay. Who are not Jewish. They're from the nations. So the Gentiles come to worship Jesus when he's born, while the Jewish king Herod tries to murder him. And at the end of the gospel, Jesus says, go out to the non-Jewish people. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to observe whatever I've told you. And lo, I'm with you always to the end of the world. Matthew 28, 19 and 20. So that's where Matthew finishes. Luke doesn't stop there. He goes on into the book of Acts and tells another story for another 20 or 30 years after Easter. Okay, so Luke's gospel is volume 1 of a 2-part story. That's one of the differences between Luke and Matthew. Luke chapter 1 tells us why he's doing it. John chapter 20, verses 30-31, tells us why that material was gathered. Matthew has nothing that says why he's doing this. We've just got to read between the lines, as it were. But it's pretty clear that Matthew is like a new and enlarged edition with new material of the Gospel of Mark. He's basically taken the Gospel of Mark, added on the infancy stories, added on a proper ending, and also added in the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6 and 7. A little bit of other tweaking here and there, but that's more or less what you have in Matthew's Gospel. Everything from Mark, plus a whole lot of material that Mark forgot to tell you, so I'm going to tell you now. So Matthew is taking the Gospel of Mark and making it more suitable for a community of Christian Jews somewhere in Antioch or near Antioch, near the end of the 1st century. So how do we unravel this? This is what keeps New Testament scholars awake at night and fighting with each other. The theory that almost every priest you've ever met has been taught in seminary is this one. A long time ago, during the lifetime of Paul, but towards the end of Paul's life, before the destruction of Jerusalem, the early Christians collect sayings of Jesus into a document. Perhaps just called the Sayings of the Lord or something like that. That document no longer exists, but it's quoted, apparently, by both Matthew and Luke. After the war, after the Jewish revolt from 66 to 74, most people would say round about 74, 75. So straight after the war, Mark's Gospel is written. And one of the big points of Mark's Gospel is, gee, you guys deserve this. You deserve to have your temple destroyed. You deserve to have your city knocked down because you killed Jesus. And we told you what would happen. And look what's happened. Okay? It's not exactly an interfaith document. Okay? It's a polemic. It's a Christian polemic against the Jews, saying, well, we told you all along that Jesus was the Messiah, but you would have none of it. And so look what's happened to you. No, kind of thing. A little bit later, 10 or 15 years later, anything we don't know what to do, date-wise, we say in mid-80s. Okay? Because we know nothing about what happened in the mid-80s. So if we think it was after Mark, but before John, we say, the mid-80s. Matthew is written, and Matthew takes over Mark, and he's still pretty hostile to the Jewish Pharisees, but he's very positive about the Jewish tradition, and he makes Jesus sound very Jewish. He sort of tones down Mark's rhetoric, and so he takes Mark, but he also draws on the sayings of Jesus from this document which has no longer survived. So Matthew is Mark plus Q, with a few little bits and pieces that weren't in Q, weren't in Mark, but they are in Matthew. 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years later, Luke comes along and does a similar kind of thing, speaking for the other side, not writing a Jewish account of Jesus, but writing a Hellenistic Roman account of Jesus, because the future of Christianity is with the Gentiles. So Luke writes a story beginning with the Gospel, including the book of Acts, which also draws on Mark, also draws on Q, and also has the sequel in the book of Acts. Okay? Now that's the so-called four-source theory, which is used a lot in seminaries and Bible colleges and so on. Okay? Suggesting that Q is even older than Mark, but Mark makes very little use of Q. He's got another agenda. He's talking about this action man, this Jesus character, the brave prophet of God, who was a bit like Moses and a bit like Elijah, but bigger than both of them put together. Kind of is where Mark is going. Okay. There are two or three other options. I'll just quickly tell them what they are. Some people say, well, that's very nice, but show me a copy of Q. Or even show me any time in the 1st or 2nd century when an early Christian refers to this other thing. He wouldn't have called it Q because they didn't have the German biblical scholars. But not only does the document not exist, nobody even mentions a lost collection of Jesus' sayings. So some people say, really, you're going to have to get by without Q, in which case Mark becomes the first. Matthew is still the second, and is basically an updating of Mark. And then Luke comes along later, using both Mark and Matthew, but most of the time choosing to go with Mark rather than going with Matthew. And then you don't need Q.
Did these people know each other, or did they take the writings? Matthew take the writings?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's
Did they know each other?
Probably not. And again, it depends where you date these things. So when we say Mark, we're talking about the book called Mark's Gospel. We're not talking about a person called Mark. Okay, there was a character called John Mark in the book of Acts, who's a companion of Paul and so on, and later on a companion of Peter. And he's usually seen as the voice behind this. But if that character is still that character is an adult travelling around with Paul, according to the book of Acts, around about 50-55 AD, the chance of him still being alive 30 years later is beginning to get really thin, given the mortality rates of that time. Okay, so Mark is not one of the disciples, not one of the 12, but he's an associate of Peter and an associate of Paul, and that's what gives him some rub-off glory from the apostles. Matthew is supposed to be, well, the book Matthew is clearly a second revised edition of Mark, but it claims to be from the apostle Matthew, one of the 12. But it's most unlikely that that the tax collector, Levi, Matthew, the tax collector, who becomes a disciple of Jesus in Matthew chapter 9 or thereabouts, it's most unusual, A, that he would have been writing in Greek, and B, that he would have basically used Mark as his source if he was one of the original 12. I mean, he wouldn't need to quote Mark, he could just tell it himself. I remember when we went, I remember the woman, whatever. So Matthew is just a name, meaning the book of Matthew. We don't really know who that was. And Matthew could have been written anywhere between about 85 or 115. So 100 AD plus or minus 15 years. Okay. And then with Luke Acts, again, we don't know who the author is. Traditionally, it's Luke, the physician, who's mentioned in 2 Timothy or something. but there are all sorts of problems there because the pastoral epistles are almost certainly not from Paul. They're probably mid-2nd century. So we've got people spread over 30 or 40 years, but it's not we're really talking with what's happening here is that the Gospel of Matthew is copying the words out of the Gospel of Mark. It's not that Matthew has been talking with Mark and made a few notes. It's not like you've heard Camelia's sermon, then you sit down to write an email to somebody to say what Camelia said in church today, but it'll be your own words. This is somebody who's had a copy of Mark and has copied it word for word, and when they make changes, we can see what the changes are and we can guess why they made them. So it tends to suggest they don't know each other. Yeah. And Luke tells us, remember Luke chapter 1, many others have written accounts about the things that happen among us. And I've gone back over them and I've looked at them carefully, and now I'm giving you my corrected version. It's a rough paraphrase, Luke chapter 1, 1-4. So again, if many others have written Gospels by the time Luke sits down, that's why I'm tending to push Luke into the early part of the 2nd century, because there has to be time for many others to write their Gospels, not just one or two. So that to me pushes the book of Luke, not the person Luke, but the book of Luke goes further back.
So we're saying that in the 1st century somewhere, some scribe has said, I'm going to put all this information that Mark says or Matthew says into a writing, and therefore it's called the Gospel according to Matthew or Mark or Luke or John.
Well, not quite. What we're saying is that the Gospel we call Mark, Gospel according to Mark, we don't know who wrote it. What that person did was to write a very simple, not very flashy story about Jesus. And in particular, he's emphasizing, well, you've heard about Moses before, you've heard about Elijah. Well, this guy is bigger than Moses, Elijah put together. And he's a figure of controversy, and you killed him, and you didn't accept him, and look at the punishment that's come on the city. And we can understand why some Christians might write something like that in the aftermath of the Romans destroying Jerusalem. Again, according to the tradition, the Christian Jews remembered sayings of Jesus that said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, head for the hills. Don't join the resistance. Okay? When that does no good for your relationship with your Jewish neighbours, if you don't even come and take up weapons to defend Jerusalem against the pagan Romans. So there's an issue going on between loyal Jews and Christian Jews about whether they should fight the Romans or whether what happened was God's judgment on Jerusalem. So that's sort of where Mark is coming out. But that's not a message that's really going to sell in the Roman Empire. Okay. Now Matthew does a bit of a rehash of it, takes over virtually everything from Mark, adds in a few more bits, cleans up the grammar, makes nicer transitions, and now he says, okay, for our church, this is our gospel. Almost certainly, well, Paul's dead by now anyway, but so remember in the back of your mind, Paul is doing all of his stuff before the destruction of Jerusalem. Paul dies in the mid-60s. The rebellion hasn't happened. Paul still goes to the temple when he's in town. Okay? He's not anti-temple. So what Mark and Matthew are doing is not at all what Paul was doing. This is actually, if anything, a rejection of Paul. And say, no, we've got to keep the law. We've got to... Remember, it's Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount that has Jesus saying, do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. Not one tiny mark, not one jot, not one tittle will pass away from the law until everything is fulfilled. So Matthew is a very pro-Torah Jesus. That's not Paul. Paul is, you've got to put the Torah aside and follow Jesus. It's a very different kind of Jesus. We'll talk about Paul next week. Luke, on the other hand, and there are a couple of other explanations, but Luke is coming from a situation where it seems that he knows Mark for sure because he follows Mark very, very closely. And even when he's choosing to skip bits, it's bits of Mark that he's skipping. It's not bits of Matthew. He's skipping bits of Mark. Okay. He has some common material with Matthew, but he never agrees with Matthew against Mark. So that's just saying, well, this doesn't really work because some of the time Luke would have copied Matthew rather than always following Mark had he had a copy of Matthew in front of him. Okay. And the other thing is the material that's common to Matthew and Luke, Matthew has it all together in nice little chunks like the Sermon on the Mount. Luke has it all over the place. So has he actually cracked open the Sermon on the Mount and said, no, forget about that, I'm going to use it here? Or has he never read Matthew 5 to 7? You know, he's got the same words, but he's got it from somewhere else. And then the question is, well, what is the somewhere else? Well, you go back to Q. So that's if you don't have Q, Matthew has to become the critical element, sorting out the difference. The other option is that Luke went first, as in a version of Luke. And I quite like this in some ways, that just as John's Gospel, mostly John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, can each be seen as a bit like an archaeological tell, the mound. Now, a tell is created when each time the city is destroyed, they smooth it out, build a new house on top. You do that for 500 years, and your floor is now several metres above the original level. Okay? They didn't have bulldozers to come in and take it all away, go down to bedrock. They just built on top of the ruins. Now, Matthew's done exactly that. He's taken Mark and he's built on top and made it longer and bigger and a bit nicer, a bit more correct. So you can see Mark and Matthew is kind of stage 1, stage 2 of a process. In the Gospel of John, most scholars think that the Gospel of John has very, very early material, but also very, very late material. And that John is like a collection of ways of thinking about Jesus from the Johannine group of churches that grew over time and eventually became John's Gospel. But John's Gospel does include some very early material. Like John's Gospel, we heard it in church last week, part of chapter 6. John's Gospel has the crowd saying, who does this guy think he is? We know his mother and father. We know his father and his mother. Okay, now that's a very early form of Christian talking about the birth of Jesus. There's no virgin birth here. These are people who say, we know your mum and dad. Like, get over yourself. You're just a carpenter's kid. Like, yeah, I'm sorry. Carpenter's kids are very special. I'm one of them. But, you're nothing special. Okay? Now, Matthew and Luke would go, woo, 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 not correct. Joseph is not his father, and so on, okay? So they develop more sophisticated ways of talking about him. So the other way then is that Luke is not just a book that appeared in the 2nd century, but Luke is itself the Q Gospel. It's what happened to the Q Gospel. It didn't disappear. Just as Mark got absorbed into Matthew, the Q Gospel got absorbed into Luke. And that the earliest layer of Luke is actually the Q Gospel. And that's why Luke and Matthew have so much in common, but the difference is Matthew added bits of Q to Mark, whereas Luke developed the inherited Q Gospel and added more material to it. Sometimes from Mark, mostly from Mark, but sometimes just his own material as well. So you get like a tell. Free literary tell.
The sayings from.
Well, if what this is saying, what this is suggesting is, this will probably answer exactly that. So this is saying that there was a version of Luke, and this is a theory. It's been around about 100 years, called Proto-Luke. That just as Mark is kind of Proto-Matthew, there was a Proto-Luke, and basically it started at what today we call Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Go and look at Luke chapter 3, it has a whole lot of rulers and in the fear of when Augustus was king and so-and-so was governor of wherever and this person was the high priest. That sounds like the beginning of a story. But in front of it, Luke has put 2 chapters talking about the birth of John the Baptist, the birth of Jesus, the Annunciation, the visit to the temple, and so on. So lots and lots of scholars earlier on had suggested that Luke itself went through a couple of stages before it reached the form we know it in, and that those earlier forms, which wouldn't have been called Luke, might have been called the Sayings of the Lord, whatever. We call it Proto-Luke. That's a modern label for it. We would have just called it the Teachings of Jesus or something like that. They were available to Mark, as we've already seen, and there are some bits of that appear to be in Mark. But then Matthew has taken Mark and has access to this document. We know it must be there because Matthew and Luke have the same material, word for word the same. Even the grammar and the syntax is the same. So we know this had to be a written document that both Matthew and Luke have used, and they've just basically cut and pasted. It wouldn't have been called Proto-Luke. It wouldn't have been called the Q Gospel, but the Sayings of the Lord, a Sayings Gospel. And that much later on, Luke has come along, the person we call Luke, and he's got this earlier version that's been growing over the years and slowly developing more and more material. And he's also got access to Mark, and he's also aware of Matthew, but most of the time he just ignores Matthew. I mean, if you think, for example, the story of the birth of Jesus. Matthew has the Holy Family living in Bethlehem, in a house. There's no annunciation to Mary at the well or anywhere else. Joseph has a dream about his fiancée getting pregnant. Okay, not that sort of dream, but he has a dream where he's told by an angel in a dream. Joseph, remember, is a character from the Old Testament who has dreams. That's what Josephs do in the Bible. Okay, that's the Joseph job, to have dreams and say things. So, and that's very Jewish of Matthew, to say, well, let me tell you a story about Jesus. There's this guy called Joseph, and they go, oh yes, and he had dreams. Actually, he did have dreams, but his dream was about the fact that his fiancée's son was going to be somebody really special. And it wasn't actually his own son because she was a virgin. But he still agreed to kind of hang around and be the foster father and so on. There is no census. There is no annunciation. There's no John the Baptist. There's no Zechariah. There's no Elizabeth. There's no going to Ein Karem for the visitation. That's all in Luke. Okay, who does turn up? The wise men. And they don't go to the manger. They go to the house where Mary and Joseph live, and they escape to Egypt because they're being persecuted by Herod. Oh, go to Egypt. That's what Joseph did. He went to Egypt, and then eventually he brought the rest of his family down to Egypt, and then they all came back. Guess what? Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus, who's now 2 or 3 years old, come back but decide to go to Nazareth instead of going back to Bethlehem. That's Matthew's infancy story. It has nothing in common with Luke except the baby's called Jesus. The mum and dad are Joseph and Mary, and the baby's born in Bethlehem. But this baby isn't worried about Herod. His parents aren't worried about Herod. They take him into the temple for his circumcision. Okay? They don't run off to Egypt. In the meantime, you've got the stories of John the Baptist's conception is also miraculous, and Mary goes to visit Elizabeth. And all. So Luke has a totally different story of the birth of Jesus. So Luke is saying, no, it didn't happen that way, Theophilus. It happened this way. Okay? He's not just modifying Luke's story. He's dumping Matthew's story, and he's putting in a totally different story, which is a story about 2 boys. They're related, according to Luke. Only in Luke, Jesus and John are cousins. Nowhere else in the Bible are they cousins. Okay? So here's the story about 2 boys, both of which are really special kids, and God has a big plan for one of them. Now, if you're a Roman citizen, you know a story about 2 boys. They're called Romulus and Remus. They're brothers. They're thrown out by their jealous father, who doesn't want to be murdered as per the oracle by one of these sons. So it's a bit like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, sends the boys out with a hunter, with a farm worker, take the boys out to the forest and kill them. But he's a nice farm worker and he doesn't want to do that, so he just abandons them under a log. He's a nice guy. Okay. Donk, 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 donk. Up comes the she-wolf, who instead of eating the baby boys, adopts them and feeds them with her own milk. Hence the statues of the wolf with the twin boys suckling from the she-wolf. Every Roman person knew the story of two boys, children of destiny. One of them is going to be the ruler of the world. Two boys, one called John, one called Jesus. One of them is going to be the ruler of the world. Guess which one it is? Okay? So Luke is not just modifying Matthew's story. Luke is totally junking Matthew's story and providing a new story about the birth of Jesus. With Mary and Joseph living in Nazareth already, and they only go to Bethlehem because of the census, and they come straight back afterwards. They don't go to Egypt. Herod is not trying to kill them. Everything's fine, because in Luke's story, the Roman Empire is always on the side of the gospel. The empire is not the enemy of the gospel in the book of Acts and in the book of Luke. Okay, whereas for Matthew and his Jewish mates, the empire is the enemy. So in the birth of Jesus, Herod, the empire's man, is trying to kill the baby Jesus. Okay, so see how they're giving slightly different spins to the story. Now we actually have, this is getting way too complicated, but we have one of the early papyrus, appears to be an extract from Luke before we got to this stage. Okay, so we actually do have one piece of papyrus which could possibly be a piece of the Gospel of Luke before it became the Gospel of Luke, which is kind of really special. Okay, so they're the three models that scholars work with. Mark is critical to all of them. The question is whether there was this other, wherever it came from, Matthew and Luke shared some material which they've used word for word but not in the same place, which tends to suggest Matthew is not as important to Luke as Mark was. So most people will either go for this version here. Oops, sorry, I went too far. Oh, goodness me. Slowly. Okay, that's what most theologically trained clergy will say. This is how the Gospels got written. People that like some recent trends in biblical scholarship, I think they're pretty cool, say, no, we're going to get by without Q, in which case Matthew has to do the heavy lifting. Mark is still there. If you don't have Q, then Matthew is the only way to explain the extra stuff. I'm one of those weird people who actually think it's more like this. That yes, Mark was really important, but there was this early saying, which some scholars call Q, but I want to call it Luke stage 1. And by the time Luke is finalised, early in the 2nd century, he's picked up Mark and added it in. He's picked up some other material, like his birth stories that are totally unique. Well, unique, can't be totally unique. And he's basically ignoring Matthew, and I want to suggest he's also ignoring John. That when he says, other people have had a crack at this before me, but now I'm going to tell you how it really is, he's actually meaning Matthew and John. Okay? In other words, they're not buddies. They're actually early Christian leaders who are disagreeing with each other about how to tell the Jesus story. Disagreements in the church? Surely not. Okay, so Matthew is an enlarged second edition of Mark, I've been suggesting, so he's trying to improve on Mark. Luke tells us that many others had written Gospels before he prepared, too many his's there, he prepared his corrected version. John may have been one of those many. Okay, now most New Testament scholars would say Mark was written first, then Matthew about 10 years or so later, Luke just a little bit after Matthew, and then John about 10 years later. But I'm saying actually no, I agreed Mark first, then Matthew, then I think John is next. And remember, the earliest fragment of any New Testament gospel is a fragment of the Gospel of John, P52, Papyrus 52, dated around 125. In other words, John wasn't as late as some people think it was. And then I think Luke is the last of the Gospels, and I think he's standing back looking at everybody else's work and says, nah, I'm going to tell it differently. Because I'm now speaking, I'm proclaiming the gospel to the empire. I'm wanting to reach people who are doing very nicely, thank you, with the empire. And I want to show them you can be good citizens of Rome and still be Christian. I think that's what Luke is doing. So the question is, did Luke disagree with his predecessors? Or did he, he's making changes. Why is he doing this? And my suggestion is that Luke is actually wanting to correct his predecessors, and that he intended people like Theophilus to stop reading Mark, and to stop reading Matthew, and to stop reading John, and to only read his version of the gospel. Okay? Which of course included the book of Acts as well. But the church said no. We're going to keep all four. We're going to keep Matthew's version because that's how we talk to Jewish people about Jesus. We're going to keep Luke because that's how we speak to the people of power in the empire. We're going to keep John because that's how we speak to the Gnostics and the people that are into Greeks of philosophy. And for some reason they decided to keep Mark, okay? Which doesn't bring anything to the party. Everything that Mark says you can get from Matthew or Luke, more or less. But Mark represents the voice of Peter. And that was a voice they wanted to hear. It was also because, and they tell us this late in the 2nd century, why do we have 4 Gospels? Because there are 4 winds and they come from the 4 corners of the earth. Therefore, there have to be 4 Gospels and there cannot be 5. That is a really weak argument, of course. None of us are going to, you want to buy a bridge? None of us are going to buy that argument. But you can see, once the idea is there, do we have 4 Gospels, 3 Gospels, or a guy called Tatian, I think it was, he said, no, we can solve this. And he mashed all 4 Gospels into one, called the Diatessaron, the 4 become one. And he produced a kind of he took a bit of Matthew and a bit of Mark and a bit of Luke, a bit of John. He made one continuous story. It would have been perfect. Only one gospel. The gospel of Jesus, only one book talking about it. And the church said, no, that's not the apostolic witness. The apostolic witness does not speak with one voice. Okay? We've got to listen to Matthew's way of telling it, and we've got to listen to Luke's way of telling it. And we have to listen to John's way of telling it. And we've got an empty spot there, so let's listen to Peter's way of telling it as well. Okay? Peter/Mark. Because we need to hear all of these voices if we're going to follow Jesus. Not just be Luke Christians or Matthew Christians or Mark Christians. Okay? That's my best guess as to why we ended up with 4 Gospels rather than picking one, throw the rest out. Or, as Tatian tried to do, amalgamate the 4, mash them into a single gospel, where there were no disagreements, there were no discrepancies. Everything was smoothed out. Okay, so 4 Gospels, each with a slightly different history and voice, gives us a much more robust historical basis for our faith than one set of evidence where all the disagreeable bits have been chiselled off to make it nice and smooth. Anyway, that's my perspective on it. And how does that sit with you guys? Got a few minutes to go.
It's an example of Christianity today. There's so many different sources of
Yeah, I mean, there are different expressions of Christianity today, and one of the things we're beginning to realise is that even in earliest Christianity, the way that Paul saw things is not how people like James saw things. And once we remind ourselves of that, we go back and read the letters of Paul more closely. We say, well, of course, he tells us that. that he and Peter had a big argument about how much to include the Gentiles or not to include the Gentiles. According to the book of Acts, Paul was so angry at Mark, John Mark, who went with him on the first missionary journey but then pulled out halfway because he had a headache or something. He wanted to go home to mummy. And so Paul said, I'm not having him with me ever again, like out. So Barnabas says, okay, well, I'll go with Mark and we'll go off this way and you and Silas can go off that way. I mean, they weren't always nice to each other in the early church. And certainly after Paul's death, second half of the first century, Paul's theology was on the nose. And then Paul comes back into flavour in the early part of the second century, which happens to be when Luke and Acts, I think, are written. And Luke and Acts are part of the let's bring Paul back into the church kind of movement.
This is too big a question, but
Try it anyway.
I'm interested in the post-resurrection stories, and I wondered if your account, which I found absolutely fascinating, about the different audiences, helped to explain why they're so different.
Yes, I think they do. I mean, Mark, it's hard to tell because Mark's probably got the last page missing from one of the earliest copies of the Codex. So Mark probably ended up something like Matthew 28, would be my guess. Surely he didn't end up with, nobody saw Jesus, the women were too scared to say anything. I mean, that's a really bad ending for the gospel. And while some people say, oh, such dramatic effect, leaves everything hanging. No, the gospel writers were not into leaving everything hanging. They were trying to prove that Jesus was the vindicated one, the one that God had blessed. So I'm assuming, I work with the assumption that Mark's ending, which is now lost, was probably something like what we find at the end of Matthew. And what we have in Matthew is nobody sees Jesus in the garden, the tomb. The women go to the empty tomb and the angels say, tell the disciples to go up to Galilee. That's where, remember, Jesus said he'll see you in Galilee. What happens then is the disciples go to a mountain in Galilee, probably Mount Tabor, because that's the only significant bump in the area. Jesus appears to them out of the squat. From what just said, and Jesus appeared to them. He didn't walk up the hill, okay? He didn't ride a donkey up Mount Tabor. He just kind of, bing, here he is amongst them. And he doesn't say, well, remember Matthew says, they all worshipped him, although some of them were still doubting, like, really? Am I awake? Like, what's going on here? Okay. And so the point of the Easter resurrection for Matthew is the risen Jesus wants you to go to the Gentiles. Go and make disciples. He's not saying, look, it's me, I'm alive. He's saying, go and make disciples of all nations. Teach them, baptize them, and remember, I am with you always. I am with you is, of course, Emmanuel. From the opening, you will call him Emmanuel. And they didn't call him Emmanuel, they called him Jesus. But you see you get Matthew's point. Mark we skip over. Luke that's why I think Luke is coming right at the end. Luke totally reschedules Easter.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
There are no Galilean appearances in Luke.
Right.
Everything happens in Jerusalem. Why? Because for Luke, the pattern goes like this. From Galilee to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Rome. There's no going back. There's no mention of Galilee after Jesus gets to Jerusalem. And even in Acts chapter 1, the angel said, you will be my witness, or Jesus said, you will be my witnesses in Judea and in Samaria, and he skips Galilee and into the Gentiles and to the ends of the earth. Galilee has dropped off the agenda. So for Luke, Jerusalem is the centre of the world for the tradition, but the gospel has to get to Rome. And there's no going back to Galilee. So there are no, Jesus doesn't appear by the lake and do anything with the disciples. All the road to Emmaus, Jesus in the upper room and so on, all of those stories in Luke 24 are in Jerusalem. And Acts chapter 1, when Jesus is with them before the ascension, they're on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. So Luke just rearranges Easter.
It's so disconcerting
Or it's giving us permission to be a bit imaginative and creative. And John, of course, John has both. Interesting. John chapter 20, he has appearances in the upper room in Jerusalem. A week later, in the upper room in Jerusalem, Thomas is with them. The second time, he's not with them the first time. And Jesus just kind of drops into the room, just kind of, ta-da, here I am. Okay? But then, John 21 is Jesus appearing by the lake in the Galilee, and the conversation about feed my sheep and so on. So John has a totally different set of way of talking about the gospel. For John it is, yes, it starts off in Jerusalem. There is no Pentecost because Jesus gives the Holy Spirit to the disciples in the upper room on Easter night, on the Sunday night. Pentecost is only in Luke, in the book of Acts. So yeah, we've got each of the Gospels, they even tell the Easter story in ways which reflect who their primary audience is.
You can see what it does for skepticism, don't you?
Yes, well, so if our basis for being listened to is that this is the absolute, gospel truth,
Yes, that's right.
well, gospel truth might be a bit stretchy, okay? But yet the gospel truth is we take what we know and we adapt it so it meets people's needs. That's the gospel truth.
I think what you say is so helpful.
Well, thank you. So it doesn't give us all the black and white answers, but it does give us permission to ask questions and also to be creative in the way that we share our faith and not say, well, you've got to agree with this and this and this and this or else you're not in. Maybe it's a bit more generous than that. All right, the bell has rung, which means it's just gone midday. So let's wrap it up for this week. So next week we'll have a session on Paul, and then we'll have a break for a couple of weeks, and then we'll get back into it again. Okay?
Can I ask a practical question? The people who wrote it down, the scribes who wrote it down, did they get it orally from somebody? Did somebody tell them the story and they wrote it from what they heard?
There has to have been an oral stage in the tradition because no one was walking around writing down what Jesus said. So these stories had to live orally, but Paul doesn't know them. Paul doesn't use these stories. So it's not a Pauline thing. It's another part of the church is doing this. But then once somebody has collected them into what we call Q, or the sayings gospel, someone has collected the sayings of Jesus.
In an oral form, do you think? Or
No, it's a written document because when Matthew and Luke use it, it's word for word, even to the grammar and the syntax. It's word for word. So the tradition becomes written within about 30 years of Easter. But you've got about 30 years where it's oral. Now fast forward to the early 2nd century, a bishop called Ignatius is the bishop of Antioch, which by the way is probably where Matthew's gospel was written for. And he says, don't you tell me about these written gospels. I'm not interested in written gospels. I'm only interested in the living words, the oral tradition. And he said, I know the sayings of the Lord. Now, is he quoting a book when he says that? He says, I know the sayings of the Lord. Documents can be falsified, but I know what Jesus said. Interesting little argument point from around about 110 or so in the 2nd century. Yeah. You're welcome.